Hey everyone, and welcome back to From the Author's Chair. I'm Sarah Kate Ishii. Today's episode is coming to you from Blanket Fort. Yep, I'm officially recording from inside my very own fortress of blankets in an attempt to reduce reverb and get that sweet, soft audio sound that will make the audio sound better for you to listen to. But it's a bit of a dream come true for bookish, nerdy little me. You know, every kid dreams of having a blanket fort. And then reading a fantasy book, pretending they're in some other world. It's a bit like being 10 again, except now they're my own stories, which is kind of cool. While I'm curled up in here, I've got a quick author life tip for you. If you are trying to record your own audio at home, and you don't have a fancy sound booth, and your room might be a bit echoey, try building your own little sound booth with blankets, pillows, or even inside a closet is quite a popular one, surrounded by clothes to help dull that echoey noise in the background. It's not glamorous, but it works, and it can make a huge difference in the sound quality while you figure out what works best for you. Okay, let's head back to Dynasty Codes Origin Curse. Today, we're on Chapter 4. Chapter 4. A Historical Place. Fortunately for Yoshiko's racing heart, Asumi stopped before the bridge and hid in the shadows of the main palace gardens that Yoshiko had been in only that morning. They peered through the darkness at the bridge that separated the castle grounds from the main town of Hie. Below the bridge, the deep, folk-made moat with tall, sloping stone platform walls created a steep drop into a dark, watery abyss. And in the moat, who knew what lurked in there, though Yoshiko had heard all the rumours. People claimed spirits and monsters lurked to feed on attackers who dared to raid the castle. Yoshiko wondered if it was just koi, terrapins, frogs, and ducks. That's all she had ever seen there, and she doubted they'd live in the same waters as a mystical monster. Beyond the moat was the upper region of the main town of Hie, and a road to the main street. There, in the daytime, high-end food houses and market stalls lined a bustling street. Only those that could afford to trade on the town's highest-costing land by the castle. This stretched for 2 blocks in one line, beyond which it petered out into more casual stalls. Networking out beyond this and to the side were citizen homes, starting with the more high-end and blending into commoner homes. Yoshiko had walked the first couple of streets with her parents, with Chinnen, and with her guards. She'd loved it, and wished she could have gone further and seen the other stalls the citizens ran, and walked down through the town to the port and seen the fishing boats. She'd wanted to go beyond the town, to see the farms and the rice fields, to see what her people got up to and talk to them, but she'd not been allowed. The only times she'd gone beyond the castle was to the forest in the north, where noble families met to hunt with their bows. Life was restricted as the daimyō's daughter, and she'd not been able to venture out as she wished. Now she'd be leaving the palace and finally stepping into the world without her guards. With the castle behind her and the town ahead, it hit the warlord's daughter that this might be the last she saw of her home, the place both she and her mother had grown up. Yoshiko looked at her mother, wondering whether she had the same nostalgia. Her mother's face was unreadable, focused. Mama's probably left the castle many times before, Yoshiko thought. It's not a change for her. She recalled the tales of her mother's warrior life before she met the young philosopher who would become her husband and Yoshiko's father. Of course, they'd never see him again. Tears stung Yoshiko's eyes again, soon halted at the sight of her mother creeping over the stone wall. "Mother, what are you doing?" Yoshiko rushed forward to look, hoping her mother hadn't gone mad. "Is she expecting us to commit family suicide in the moat? This isn't the time for some tragic story ending." Yoshiko leant over the wall, swallowing back down her heart to look for her mother in the ink blackness of the moat at night. Her eyes were wide with fear, heart drumming and mouth dry, and she waited to hear for the splash of her mother's entry in the water. No splash came. "What are you doing?" Asumi hissed back from beside her, making Yoshiko jump as she saw Asumi clinging onto the edge of the wall like a spider. "Come on!" Not for the first nor the last time that night, Yoshiko stared in bewilderment at her mother. Asumi was digging her feet and fingers into the small dents and cracks in the stone wall, climbing along the edge of the platform that led to the moat. Climbing the moats was meant to be impossible, or anyone could invade. But then she thought of her mother's strange, inhuman abilities thanks to the curse, and doubted other humans could do the same. Once more, Yoshiko's heart threatened to seep through her body as she scrambled over the wall to follow her mother. There was barely room for grip, and one wrong move meant a plummet into the icy depths below, a potential monster, and risk of being heard and shot at with arrows by a guard defending the castle. Yoshiko's fingers burned as she gripped the small crevices with all her might, edging her way diagonally down the wall, slowly nearing the bridge. Her mother kept just on the edge of her sight, and Yoshiko felt relieved the curse meant she could see in the dark, and watch how her mother was clambering along the wall so well. Asumi moved with strangely well-practiced precision, and once more, Yoshiko wondered how much of a habit she had of climbing in and out of the compound. Her mother's face was as clear and determined as ever, almost peaceful, as if this was a mere walk in the gardens. But Yoshiko's muscles ached and shook, her fingers grazed and clutched the stone, and sweat trickled down her face and neck, making her itchy as it slithered all over her skin. Then her fingers met something damp and slippery, and her fear spiked. Yoshiko wasn't quick enough to grab for another hold, and dropped down the steep stone wall towards the moat. Clenching her eyes just as much as she clenched her fingers, trying to find a new grip, Yoshiko bit her lip to prevent screaming out with the pain of digging her fingers into the wall, the stone burning through her fingertips. Terrified she'd fall into the moat and ruin their escape, Yoshiko somehow managed to open her eyes and grab at a large stone. She missed. A claw-like grip grabbed at her wrist, and Yoshiko's fall jolted to a stop, pulling on her shoulder painfully. When she looked up, her mother hung from the wall with one hand, catching her daughter with the other. Asumi nodded and kept a hawk-like grip on her daughter's wrist until Yoshiko had managed to secure herself on the wall once more. Yoshiko's fingers throbbed with pain, and she could feel the heat of blood. Knowing the only way to fix her injured fingers was to escape to somewhere safe, she followed her mother again, determined to ignore the terrified drumming of her heart and the pain in her fingers and shoulder as she clutched the stone walls for dear life. Their climb grew darker in the shadow of the bridge. No moonlight shone there, and Yoshiko relied on her extended sight and senses alone. Her mother continued with no problem, hands and feet expertly finding impossible holds. Almost moving by feel, Yoshiko lightly bumped into her mother, who had stopped suddenly underneath the bridge. They weren't low yet. Yoshiko imagined it would only take a few steps upwards before hitting her head on the bridge above. So why had they stopped? Wouldn't they need to climb lower to swim across the moat and climb up the other side? Footsteps on the stone path from the castle down to the gate and bridge tapped at the edge of Yoshiko's hearing, and both women looked at each other in the shadows of the bridge, just close enough to see one another in the darkness. Someone cleared their throat above, and more footsteps, someone in heavy armour, stomped to meet the newcomer on the path. "Sir?" Yoshiko imagined it was a guard speaking, greeting whoever had come from the castle. "They've escaped. Don't let anyone leave the castle tonight. If you see them, don't let them through, and send someone to get me." The voice sounded strained, anxious, but Yoshiko couldn't recognize it. Her mother frowned too, concentrating, clinging to the stone wall to listen to the conversation above. "Who, sir?" "The daimyō and Lady Yoshiko," the strained voice said. "They've gone." A cluttering as more feet stomped above, and new voices joined in. "What? What's happened? Are they safe?" Yoshiko's arms shook, and she wished the messenger would leave so her mother would move again. She wasn't certain her stinging fingers could hold on much longer. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Just don't let them leave. Send out a hunt to find them." The messenger sounded frustrated, and Yoshiko could hear their scuffing shoes on the stone as they turned and padded back up the stone path towards the palace, leaving the guards mumbling to one another, confused at the main gate. Then, a loud creaking and a heavy thud as the main ottoman gate shut, and a second thud as heavy wooden beam was put in place to lock it. There'd be no one entering or leaving the gate tonight, and the guards, grumbling in confusion to one another about keeping the daimyō in and wondering whether she was well, sent news to the barracks and the watchtowers in the castle grounds to send out a hunt to find their warlord and her daughter, and bring them home to what they thought was safety. And when it finally fell quiet again, Asumi nodded to Yoshiko and crept along the side of the wall again, leaving Yoshiko wondering whether it was much further to go before she could put her feet on safe ground again, rather than clinging on with injured fingers. "We're here," Asumi said mere moments later, to Yoshiko's relief, voice barely audible. Yoshiko blinked and looked around in the darkness. "Where? We're just hanging on for our lives on the side of a wall, still under the bridge." She could barely call that anything to be proud of. They'd have to be so much further away from the palace by sunrise to call it a successful escape. Or was her mother planning to clutch here, bodies aching and straining, until things quietened down? There was never a time there were no guards at any of the castle entrances, and the gate door had been shut now, for who knew how long. Yoshiko turned back to her mother to question her plans, but Asumi had disappeared. Again, Yoshiko's heart stopped, and she waited to hear the splash of her mother's body hitting the water. Even just the sound of scraping on the stone would give her some clue as to where her mother had gone. But she wasn't anywhere. Yoshiko searched desperately, straining her eyes in the darkness, listening out for any sound at all. In her frantic searching, her bleeding fingers nearly lost their grip on the wall. She grasped the wall harder than ever, and clenched her eyes and teeth to keep herself from plummeting into the moat. "Keep calm, Yoshi." That was her mother's voice. It had floated from somewhere inside the rock. "Follow my voice. Be careful." Yoshiko wondered how her mother's voice had merged into the wall, and whether people could absorb through stone. There were stranger things in folk tales. She clenched her eyes more and willed herself into the rock, pushing her body against it, achieving nothing. There was a moment of awkward silence. "No, move to where I was, a bit more to your right. Careful, the stone falls away into nothing. It's safe, but take care you don't fall." Embarrassed, her cheeks burning, Yoshiko found her way to a doorway in the stone. Her mother was waiting for her, out of the way. When Yoshiko was in the entranceway, her feet firmly on the stone floor, Asumi yanked her inside, edged past her, and pushed a heavy door over the mouth of the tunnel. Blackness enveloped them. Not even Yoshiko's eyes could see in this. A flame licked out of nowhere, and a stone corridor became visible. Yoshiko looked over to see a lantern in her mother's hand. You haven't been carrying that around with you, have you? She couldn't remember seeing her mother carrying anything. See there, Asumi indicated with her dark eyes. Yoshiko saw lanterns resting against the side of the passageway, easy to find if you knew where they were. But how had her mother lit the lantern? The two women looked back at the closed-off door. It's crafted and painted to look like stone, Asumi explained after seeing Yoshiko's confused expression. Unless you know to look for it, your eyes will pass by it, expecting it to just be part of the wall. Yoshiko's eyebrows rose in surprise, and she looked again, leaning closer to the door to try to see the extent of the crafting skills. Asumi turned and started walking down the passageway, deeper into the stone under the palace. Yoshiko rushed to follow before the disappearing lantern swallowed the light behind it, trying to ignore the pain in her scratched fingers. You can't see it from the bridge, so it doesn't matter from there. From certain angles on the other side of the moat you can, so it had to be carefully crafted to be unnoticeable. An ancestor created it. My grandmother and mother showed it to me before I married your father, telling me to keep it secret even from him, unless absolute need came to use it. Her mother's voice trailed off, and Yoshiko noticed sadness creeping back into it. Yoshiko saw her mother's posture change. Asumi, who usually held herself so tall and strong, looked small now. The wild look to her hair, with strands poking out from the quick updo she'd pinned, looked more messy than warlike. Yoshiko felt the silence that followed weigh too heavily on them, and her nerves picked up. So, it's a secret tunnel? She asked, hopeful yet feeling foolish at the same time. All the best stories had secret tunnels. She heard a small chuckle slip through Asumi's lips, unable to see the warm smile she knew would flash upon her mother's face. Even so, Yoshiko was thankful for the slight ease of emotions that laughter had given. Knowing it might be safer now, Yoshiko asked if she could ask the questions she'd been burning to ask earlier. Yes, it's safe to talk now. Asumi glanced around and continued. This tunnel runs deep under the castle grounds and the moat, into a network of other tunnels and chambers that run below the main town. I'll show you more of it and the multiple entrances we'll be using later, once we've rested. It's a safe place we can use for now. No one will be down here, and no one outside of the tunnels will hear us or even notice any sign we're here at all. Yoshiko tried to organize her questions into some logical order. She suddenly wanted to ask more about the secret passageways and why they were built, how big they were, and what they were used for. But the most important question of the evening was about her father's murder. The chill of the dark stone tunnel shivered down her back, and she pulled the ribbon from her hair to let it fall loose around her shoulders for even a tiny bit more warmth. Even with a thick haori, the stone tunnel felt cold, yet her mother was walking with just a light jacket. Mama, why are we running? Who is after us? I know you think someone in the castle killed Papa, but wouldn't it give away that we knew if we left? Couldn't we have left normally, saying we were heading to a shrine? And wouldn't it let down the people? We should be there for them. Yoshiko reached up to play with a strand of her hair while she asked, but stopped when the wounds on her fingertips flashed pain through her arms. Asumi paused for a moment on a stairwell that led downwards, probably deeper than even the moat, and looked up at her daughter. The two women's eyes met, and Yoshiko saw the extent of the fear, pain, and worry in her mother's night-black eyes. Her mother's face looked haunted. The woman Yoshiko knew to be fearless, powerful, confident, the dragon daimyō, had never seemed so afraid. Then, Asumi had turned her back again and padded down the steps. "That did trouble me," Asumi admitted. "But the reality of someone coming after us next was too great. We can't look after our people if we're dead." Yoshiko gasped and trotted down the steps a little quicker to catch up to her mother. "Do you really think they'd have killed us too? It didn't seem real, somehow." "Little dragon," Asumi sighed, calling Yoshiko by her childhood nickname. "They killed your father, a well-loved, peaceful man, in his own camp, on a peaceful mission. Whoever it was had no fear of doing that, no fear for the skills of his guards, so it must have been someone with high enough influence in the castle to have support from people equally strong and skilled to fight. Hitoshi was surrounded by powerful warriors who would, and did, die to protect him. Somehow, the enemy succeeded. Then, they thought us weak because we're women, and thought they could kill us too. In our castle, surrounded by guards and maids, we are no safer than your father surrounded by his guards. And they think we will be easy prey. I did not hesitate to think they would come after us." Asumi stopped again, tugging at her long sleeves and looking at the lantern before continuing with a low thought, barely a whisper. "In fact, they already did." Yoshiko froze, a chill coursing through her, and she stared at the back of her mother's head, breath catching. Her mother remained still and silent for a moment, letting it sink in. "Did you notice how quiet the palace was this evening?" Asumi asked, letting the question weigh heavily but not waiting for a response. "How there were fewer people in the rooms and hallways before bed. I felt they were setting things up. People who are usually there weren't there. I wanted to rule and guide our people, but I knew then we had no choice. That we had to live and fight another day. I was worried I couldn't make it back to your chambers in time. You have no idea how relieved I was I got to you first." Yoshiko's mouth felt dry. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "It's really that bad?" Asumi nodded slowly and moved again, striding along a tunnel with purpose. "You heard them on the bridge. They stopped our leaving. The council is acting. Someone with great control over the council has won them all. Our only hope to help our domain is to escape now and find out who it is and stop them." Yoshiko shuddered and followed, stunned, staring into the darkness beyond and wondering when it was going to lead somewhere, or whether it would go on forever until they fell into the sea. As they walked, Yoshiko thought back to her own experiences that evening, trying to figure out what she missed. Maids had tended the daimyō and Yoshiko at dinner as normal, but the silence and mourning had made more of an impact on her at the time. Then she thought back to the corridors. Where people would usually shuffle past in the hallways, there was less shuffling. Where she would usually see people going about their duties, it was as if everyone had already gone home. Then, as she'd lain in bed, trying not to let anyone hear her weep, there hadn't been anyone passing her chambers on their usual evening patrols to hear her weep anyway. The palace had been silent. What she'd thought had been the hush of mourning, Asumi had spotted as something sinister. "How did I miss that?" she whispered, chastising herself, hugging her arms around her for comfort. "It's the unknown of danger," Asumi said. "You don't know it until you've lived it. It's always like this in feudal times, but I've tried to shield you from it, to make our domain safe for you and our people. I want you to be able to rule in peace when I'm gone, without the fear of other regions coming in and taking our land and our people. But now, it's come from the inside. Yoshiko's blood felt like it had frozen at the realization of how much power these people had. To make the daimyō and her family feel so helpless and alone in their own keep, to make that safe place feel like an isolated cage that left them with no option but to run. For all the training they'd made sure she'd had, she'd failed to notice the signs when it was necessary. Yet her mother had noticed. Her mother was more powerful than these people believed. If it hadn't been for Asumi making that decision, Yoshiko now realized that neither of them would have woken to the next dawn. And that's it for Chapter 4. Thanks so much for being here with me. Whether you're listening from your commute, your couch, or your own version of a blanket fort, which is actually really quite warm by the way, it's going to be perfect for winter. I appreciate you joining me on this audiobook and author journey. If you're enjoying this podcast, don't forget to follow or subscribe, and you can always find me online at Sarah-Kate Ishii on socials. See you next time for Chapter 5. Until then, happy reading and stay creative.